right. Hello, everyone. I see folks joining and trickling in right now. Thank you so much for attending our webinar. My name is Christina Giordano, she, her, and hers, and I'm a Senior Partnerships Manager here at AllVoices. And we just want to say thank you for attending How to Support the Full Lives of Employees, including a grief inclusive work culture. And it's hosted by AllVoices and Better Leave. And we're going to get more into the topic shortly. Before we dive in, I want to launch a quick poll and give folks a chance to hop on. So we'll be attending HR Tech this year and want to know if we'll be seeing you there. So if you could just fill that out, and then we will get started in about a minute here. All right, I am going to just end the poll here, and then I would love to pass over to our moderator, Brooke James, who is absolutely incredible. She was on our podcast, Reimagining Company Culture, and she's the founder, host, producer of The Grief Coach. You should definitely check that out as well. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat. But Brooke James, I will pass it over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christina. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited about this panel. We have a lot we want to talk about, so we're going to get straight into introductions. Kara, if you can go first, please.
Absolutely. Make sure I unmute myself. I'm Kara Abbott. I'm the founder and the CEO of Better Leave. We are a bereavement care solution built to support employees, individuals, and their families as they navigate the complex bereavement care landscape, from the logistical aspects to the mental health and emotional piece, and also the financial well-being piece. My background before Better Leave was partnering with HR leaders and business leaders for high growth people initiatives at tech companies. And so really partnering with managers, thinking about how to build high performing teams, thinking about team dynamics, major life events that large workforces are going through. So happy to be here and discuss some of my learnings, as well as how grief can impact the team dynamic.
Great, thank you. I'm going to go in order of who I see on my screen. So Ben, if you can go next, please.
Happy to. So I'm Dr. Ben Medrano. I'm a board certified psychiatrist. I'm also the medical director of New Life Health, and New Life Health is a tech-enabled mental health company that focuses on integrative approaches, including ketamine-assisted therapy, and we are a home-based intervention. My background is also much more broad in regards to my sort of frame of thinking and approach towards topics like this. I have a lifelong practice in Buddhism. I spent most of my life studying with a lot of Tibetan Buddhist teachers, actually at a Tibetan Buddhist center right now. And so this is a topic that's very near and dear to me as I contemplate what I've spent my life contemplating, and that is death. I'll pass it on.
Thank you. Alicia, if you can go next, please.
Hi, my name is Alicia Drew. I am an account coordinator team lead at MicMac, and additionally, I am our former co-lead of the Mental Health Coalition employee resource group that we have. I co-led that group for right about a year, and what we focus on is trying to find ways to improve like the work-life balance of our employees, and finding ways to create safe spaces to talk about tough things such as grief and the different challenges that we all face at work and in our personal lives as well.
Great, thanks. And Savannah, if you can finish us off.
Hello, everyone. My name is Savannah Barker. I am the head of people at Untapped. We're an all-in-one recruiting platform that helps connects companies with underrepresented talent. And I really oversee everything sort of spanning the employee life cycle. So from the very first touch when we're recruiting to onboarding once we bring someone in the door, and really kind of I would say our diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging efforts are really integrated through that whole process. we're a remote first team. So building an employee experience and a culture that feels welcoming, and where folks really feel like they can bring their whole selves to work is kind of our North Star. So I'm really excited to be here and be part of this conversation.
Excellent. Really excited to hear what y'all have to say today. Quick background on me. I founded the Grief Coach podcast. I have a background in financial services and tech, but after I experienced the loss of my father, realized that I could not find references or resources, that worked for me. And so started a podcast that now has a global audience. If you haven't listened, would appreciate you checking it out. The later episodes are much better than earlier ones. And always looking for new guests. So if anyone is interested in learning more about that, happy to talk about that offline. Okay, so let's get right into it. Our first topic is defining grief inclusivity. What does grief inclusivity mean to you? And what are the benefits of that for employers and employees?
I'm happy to take that. And Dr. Medrano, please feel free to jump in. But I think how we at Better Leave really define, I'll start with inclusive benefits and then go into grief inclusivity. So when you think about building an inclusive benefit program or well-being program, you want to think about things that create a greater sense of safety and belonging. You want to think about things where you can create open discussions for issues that are maybe personal and work-related. Increase kind of empathy and compassion of your group, all of these wonderful things when you think about grief inclusive benefits. And you want to think about inclusivity across age, sexual orientation, gender identity, all of these components, right? So if you think about that and you want to build an inclusive kind of benefit program, and then you think about grief inclusivity, well, grief can mean different things to different people. It can be bereavement or death related grief, right? From an illness, maybe an accident, even pregnancy loss. But there also is grief and loss around job loss, relocation, divorce, separation, immigration, pet loss. There is a really wide ranging, I'd say, umbrella of what grief inclusivity is. And so at Better Leave, we really believe that building policies, programs, and activities for employers and individuals, we can really cover that span of the different types of grief topics so that everyone, regardless if they're single or married, maybe they've lost a pet or maybe they've lost a spouse is getting the same support. As you mentioned, Brooke, the right support for them based on the experience they're having. So Dr. Medrano, I'll pass it off to you for your thoughts.
Well, that's tough to follow, Kara. And it's actually a beautiful thing to hear how you're thinking about it and how your company is thinking about it. It's very refreshing. I was contemplating this grief inclusivity approach, and I actually was thinking a little bit outside of the box about how actually we got to this point culturally that we even need to have this conversation actually. And so even just the human nature is that we actually seek pleasure and avoid pain. And the topic of death is one of the most difficult topics for people to even begin to contemplate. So starting for grief and inclusivity, I think it starts with noting that in yourself, our own fear of even thinking about it, let alone talking about it. And so that's the starting point. And then when I think of the inclusivity aspect, that is actually beginning, once you get past your own understanding of grief, your own feelings about it, beginning to be curious about how other people think, rather than projecting your own ideas about how other people think. So it's really at the core nature, it's being comfortable with grief within yourself, being comfortable with the idea that we will all die at some point, and that's an inescapable truth. And also being comfortable sharing that human experience with others, knowing that most of us have lost at the bare minimum, at least a pet or somebody close to us, and knowing how hard that was for us, but also appreciating that people grieve in different ways. And that's from the cultural perspective all the way down to the psychological perspective. One other aspect that comes to mind is we're coming from a long-standing establishment of a medicalized view of what bereavement is. And that has been very limiting. So speaking again as a psychiatrist, I think we have a lot of evolving to do as a field, and just simply beginning to talk about this rather than labeling someone with a diagnosis. Believe it or not, bereavement is a diagnosis. I think it's debatable that that should even be considered a mental health issue at all. Bereavement is part of being human. And so taking that in, that we're coming from a society where we have pathologized it and even put timestamps on it is really not the right approach. So I'm just really happy that we're having this conversation and being inclusive of different approaches and experiences.
Absolutely. And I love that as we're moving forward culturally, that we're including so many different aspects of loss, and that people are starting to understand that it is, to your point, Dr. Medrano, a medical diagnosis and experience. Alicia and Savannah, I wonder if you have any examples of things that you've seen beyond leave, or it's one thing for an employer to say like, yes, of course, we understand you're doing this, but like at the end of the day, they're a business and like they are looking to accomplish business objectives. So what have you seen in your experience or in speaking with other people you know, that's like tactical way that people, employers can support their employees when they're going through a loss? And if anyone wants to answer, but would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, I can jump in on this one a little bit. Being a manager of a team and then also essentially managing the mental health coalition that we have, which is a variety of employees across the entire company and their perspectives and experiences, I have actually come across a few different modes of that actually. So I had one person who was a member of our mental health coalition that experienced a sudden loss, and they reached out to me on the side and they actually wanted to host like a talk about what they were going through. And that was new to me as a mode of coping. I thought that was great. So of course, facilitated it, asked for their permission to, explain it to the other co-lead, and they got that going. And I also had someone else who experienced a loss, and I was like, no, take time off. And they're like, no, I want to work, so there's just so many different ways and different approaches of supporting everyone. And it's not a one size fits all. And there's some people who your first thought might be, oh, I got to get everyone's support. Let me pass around a card for this person, have everyone know what's going on with them, sign it and give it to them. And some people don't want that attention, and they would be okay with just receiving flowers to their house, like maybe just, from their manager, and not having everyone be aware of exactly what's happening. So just what I've learned is just simply offering that bereavement time isn't always the answer, and that there's a myriad of ways that people cope and prefer support. And it's simply not like a one size fits all approach. So just keeping an open mind to what everyone needs and how to best support what they need from us.
Yeah. And I would just add to that. I think it was mentioned earlier, sort of the financial component is something that we spend a lot of time focused on. We have sort of a dedicated financial wellness benefit where our employees are able to access a network of CPAs and financial advisors that they don't have to pay for. And we found that obviously there's a kind of huge range of benefits that can come from that. But I think in the case of grief or the loss of, again, like what we mentioned, whether it's going through a divorce or something of that nature, that having a financial advisor to talk through some of those implications can have a pretty big impact on that experience. And that financial stressors, when we've kind of run engagement surveys and benefit audits and what are the things that are kind of big external stressors for our employee population, the financial component is usually number one and number two, sort of regardless of the sort of individual salary of employees. So that's been a really interesting thing that we learned. And that was something we chose to invest in earlier this year and have seen a lot of just a lot of good come out of that, because there's only so much that myself and my team can do in terms of assisting in, you know, the financial struggles someone might be going through in the background.
That's great. Yeah, I think, Alicia, I wanted to just touch on something you said, that people need different things. Like you said someone who wanted to stay at work, like I cope with my to-do list. And so like for me, sometimes it's helpful to like have project and things and then like want to process after that. So it is interesting of sometimes what our first instinct is not necessarily what people need. So I want to talk about this concept of bringing your whole self to work, including grief. As we all know, and I think a lot of the people attending know, grief is not like, oh, okay, you have 3 days off to grieve. Grief is long and complicated, and it is sadness, but it is also logistics, which often take longer than those 3 days. And would love to talk about how employers and managers can support their full lives of employees, which is promoting this concept of work-life integration. And then what does that look like, and what are some of the benefits to that for both the employer and the employee? So Savannah, I'll let you start and then we can go around.
Can you just repeat that last part? Sorry, there's construction here, so it got a little
sorry.
noisy.
Absolutely. Yes. So this concept of work-life integration and how employers and managers can promote that, and then the benefits of that for employers and managers.
Yes, got it. So I think something that we've focused a lot of efforts into, we're a smaller company, we're a startup, 60 people. But we've really kind of invested in our people managers and helping them to learn different techniques in terms of dealing with kind of the myriad of things that could be going on in the lives of our employees. You know, yes, we have a people department, we have folks that people can come talk to, but oftentimes, especially in a remote context, right, the folks that you're interacting with the most are the people on your team and your manager. And so helping our managers to even in terms of just what kinds of questions are you asking? We have a mood meter that we use in a lot of our cross-functional meetings, where we literally just say, like, where are you at today? Are you feeling stressed? Are you tired? Are you hungry? And it's really just sort of a way to try to engender that kind of comfort and just being very honest about where you're at coming into a conversation. And I think you have to be even more intentional about that in a remote context where you don't have all of these sort of nonverbal cues that you might have in person. So I think for us, it's been a lot of focus around just empowering and helping educate and give our people managers some tools to be able to kind of unearth some of that with their people. And then if something, you know, feels more serious or feels like it's sort of above maybe where they're capable, they're able to then escalate that to myself and to my team to kind of figure out we might need more resources or support here.
Great. Anyone else wanted to jump in? Kara, I saw you went off mute.
Yeah, I would love to add 2 cents to that. I completely want to agree with what Savannah, you were saying, especially around this idea of the baseline should be bereavement leave, right? Job security. That should be the minimum. If you think about the pyramid. And then what I believe is that next layer is the financial security and financial well-being, which you just hit on. So you have job security base layer, financial security second layer, and then the third layer, I'd say, of that pyramid is really the psychological safety of that pyramid. Do we have the right communications in place with our teams and our managers? Are we giving folks space to have those conversations in the workplace, right? We're not silencing or minimizing anyone's experience that they're having. I love the mood meter example. And I also love what Dr. Medrano was saying around like a timestamp. I think the biggest, when we partner with employers and help them roll out a bereavement policy or compassionate leave policy or time around that, it is really hard because everybody is experiencing something different. And how do you put time parameters around that? I know a lot of tech companies have unlimited time off, which gives a little bit more flexibility. And then there's some companies that have pretty structured policies for time off. And how do you, in an area of, let's say, difficulty or one of life's most challenging moments, how do you define that to a moment in time? And so a lot of what we do and what we partner with employers and managers is really trying to understand what the needs are of that individual. You can do your best to put in a policy, a blanket policy, but really it's building that relationship, understanding what that person's going through, and then trying to create a program that works for them. And a bereavement program is what we call it, that works for them, understanding how they can get back up to work, at the time that's appropriate. I'd say there's also a real fear around the pressure of like maintaining performance. I know we haven't really talked about performance yet, but I think one real thing that we think about and employers think about, when I put my HR hat on, is how do we really support people in these incredibly difficult moments like we want to, and also think about the business and what does that scale look like and how do we do that effectively? And I think the fear of like maintaining performance, or even how colleagues treat us when we're back, is also something that we should dive into. And that's probably the psychology of human interaction. Like, how are we all prepared to have really crunchy conversations, right? It's one thing to be going through it, but then if you're asking your peer, how do we create that culture and that acceptance? I think those are all things I'd love to dive into. And I can speak from experience. I lost my mom a few years ago. And when I went through that entire journey and process of helping her through her end of her life and coming back to work, I felt like a completely different human being. I had just gone through this miraculous experience. I was sitting at my desk and I was like, I'm a different person. And I was going through this and I was thinking about how people were tiptoeing around me. And I was like, I have got to take a pause, and I end up taking a break, and and not to come out, but there is a real life moment and life-changing event. I'd say similar to when you're doing family forming and you're having a baby and you have a life-changing moment and you're like, okay, I've just had a life-changing moment. How can employers help people through these life-changing moments? And so I would say I agree with what everybody is saying in terms of that third pyramid. It's the hardest one to get right, but it's like, how do we create a culture of inclusivity and a culture of understanding that performance might be a gradual return to work, and all of those types of programs you can put in place.
If I may, I would like to follow up with Kara's very heartfelt share and just say thank you for actually sharing your real world experience of that kind of pain. I think that actually is the beginning of what it means to actually, I guess for lack of a word, show competence in what bereavement is, what grief is. And it brings up a richer topic of, and that you're sort of getting at it, which is how do we make sure we as employers or managers are capable of having those conversations and holding them effectively? Because when we get back to, part of the backdrop of this conversation is we're also thinking, how do we maintain productivity? How do we maintain harmony in the workplace? And at the end of the day, people need to feel safe and understood when they come to work. And to feel safe and understood when it comes to grief is very complicated. But the starting point, as I was saying in the beginning, is a sense of at least feeling okay with the topic within yourself and feeling a sense of understanding of what it means for you, what loss means for you. Because these conversations, even if they're just as simple as how much time off, can really get out of hand in terms of how that information is exchanged and delivered. And it can really be the one thing that makes it even harder for that person to ever come back. And so having some appreciation for the sensitivity of the conversation, and as we were saying, in terms of inclusivity, knowing how different cultures and different generations handle grief, and also being, again, comfortable with the topic within yourself and willing to empathize and connect on a very human level with people as you're having these conversations, not just brushing past them quickly, noticing our discomfort when it comes up, being able to notice it and at least, express it in some way to the right channels so that you can be more present for that person who is really struggling.
Absolutely. I'd love to dive in a little bit deeper into something that Kara said about how can we support colleagues, because I think when we framed the conversation, it was what can a manager do, right? But what can the team do. And when I've gone in and spoken at different companies, what they really like me to talk about is what can people do to support others at work. But so I have a lot of thoughts, but I would love to hear from other people, and I know the audience would too, of what are things you've seen be successful in terms of how other people on the team can support someone who is either out on bereavement or once they're back in the office, of what you've seen work or not work. Sometimes that's even more important to talk about.
Well, I'm happy to jump back in and share actually a really painful story that was fairly recent for me. About 2.5 months ago, a very dear friend of mine and colleague who I worked with at another clinic. So I also work with another psychedelic assisted therapy clinic called Field Trip. And we have a clinic in New York that he was helping me manage. And David and I knew each other for years working in mental health. And he was a very skilled therapist. And he died very suddenly at the age of 32, crossing the finish line of the Brooklyn Marathon. And it was an absolute shock to the entire team. He was very loved. He was a mentor to all the therapists in that team, and more than a mentor, a very close friend of them as well. He really impacted the lives of many people. The suddenness and also just the age of his death and his prominence was one that was very, it was so impactful that I realized the entire staff was in a state of bereavement. You know, there was a moment where I literally contemplated just shutting the clinic down and realized that, oh no, we're actually treating people who are grieving. And so we had to really take in that the impact of us, and we took this in, you know, as a community, the impact of us not being able to be available to those who are suffering in our clinic far outweighed what we needed to do. So we had to process in real time together as a community in our center as we're treating people. And so what we did is we made sure there were points at which we could actually process, you know, just making sure there was time for us to all sit down together and check in. And those points had to be sensitive to the process that people go through when you have a sudden loss. You know, 3 days after his loss was not a great time to dive into the depths of what people were experiencing. Everybody was still in a great state of shock. But we could not just show up to work and not acknowledge it together. So that was the first thing we had to do, is make sure that we had the time to sit down, make sure that there was time after that, because of course it was a very loaded conversation, to be able to pull ourselves together and get back into the room and treating our patients. And then we also arranged another time for us to just have a agreed upon ceremony that was semi-secular. We did bring in various sort of spiritual traditions that we all felt an affinity towards. And we just made our own ceremony together. And we actually invited in David's wife to be there. And it was an opportunity for us to show our gratitude for being able to hold the depths of pain that she was going through as well. And just to appreciate her and let her know that, you know, we were thinking of her. And then again, we had another check-in more about a couple months out for those who were closer to him. So it really took a lot of on-the-fly thinking, but it all came back to you know, our just connecting on our human level with each other and making sure that we had good timestamp points for that. Also, just allowing people in the check-ins, one of the main things was just also seeing, are you actually okay to go into that room and work with that patient? And that was a day-to-day thing where I said, please make sure you're checking in on each other and do not hesitate to let us know if you do need to cancel that appointment, if you do need to take a day or two off or more. And fortunately for us, we fared well through that.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Medrano. Such a personal story, and I think one that we might have all experienced. And so I really appreciate that. And I love what you said around, we created a moment or a space for acknowledgement, but then also a memorial or celebration or whatever, however you'd like to define that. I am seeing more employers taking that moment, which I think is really beautiful. I think a good example of that is I have several friends that work at Salesforce, and this year they held a memorial for Salesforce employees that had passed, and it was a beautiful moment, a memorial, and I think they had someone come and say a few words, and it was a great moment to have. And I think it is a really, it's a great way to allow and encourage that safe space that we were talking about. We see a lot of unique memorials too. We've even partnered with employers who have lost employees to create living memorials. So if that's adopting a park bench to maybe adopting a highway, or there's little things. And so if you think about it in terms of a budget perspective, because, you know, employers are thinking about it also in terms of supporting their employees and their well-being, but also a budgetary moment, there's ways that you can create really, I would say, lasting impressions and beautiful ways to celebrate people. Memorial trees, that's a big one. I know there's a forest in California dedicated to kind of having a tree and celebrating the life of loved ones that you can do. There's also a company in Austin, Texas, where we're based, Eternova, that can turn, ashes, if that's where that person went, into diamonds. There's lots of really unique ways, I would say, even that wasn't even available 10 years ago, that we're starting to show maybe more of a conversation around, or an acceptance around what we can do. And it might be generational as well, as like religious preferences shift a little bit from generational into more conservation. Let's say now there's even more ecologically friendly options that I don't think were available even on the state level 10 years ago. And so I think you hit on something. There's ways to celebrate or memorialize or have a moment for folks that we can do as employers that, can cost money or not cost money, but still creates a really powerful moment for your team.
Thank you. So want to go into now, we talked about like how employers can show up for people. Alicia, you started to talk about this a little bit before, but how to bring in this concept of empathetic communication, which is really important and takes practice, right? With the grieving employee and notifying others. So you had mentioned that some people that you've seen prefer just to keep it quiet and they want flowers from the manager. Some people want a card, but do you, in observing all of these different things, do you have best practices when you're determining how you notify the rest of the team, or if anyone else has things that they've seen work or not work? I'd love to hear about them.
Yeah, so far, I feel like really with grief, it's just always learning as you go, because, for instance, I never would have imagined that someone would have reached out to me to want to essentially hold like a small talk to our employee resource group about the topic of what they were going through. That's very unique to me. And I don't know if I would come across that again. So I think on a high level, I suppose best practice would be just having an empathetic ear and being open to listening to what it is that they want and the type of privacy they would like to have, or the type of exposure. Because when that person came to me, there's two of us that co-lead, well, I'm former, but co-led that group. And instead of me just running over to the other person, be like, hey, so-and-so reached out to me, this is what they want to do, what do you think? I checked in with them first. I was like, I know you reached out to me specifically. Are you okay with me explaining this to our other co-lead, and also eventually telling the group and getting that perspective before I just went and did it? And that's something that is appreciated. And also just constantly checking in. Like, for instance, the other employee that I was just like, yeah, take off, go, like, get out of here. Like, you don't have to work. You'll be fine. Like, you'll be so much better. Like, if you just, close your laptop and go. And then there's people who would prefer, from their own words, like prefer to be working to keep their mind away from what they're having to deal with the grieving, and have something else to occupy their mind versus just sitting at home doing nothing and all they can think about is that. So for me, the best practices are really just keeping an open mind and an empathetic ear and continuing to check in with that individual, because things can change. They might say for a while, like, no, I don't want to take off. I don't want to take off. And then something just hits them really hard. And like, you know what, actually, I do need to take half the day, or I do need to take a day or two. And it's still just not thinking in the one framework of, usually like 5 days of bereavement, you should be up and running and like exactly who you were like before, you know, whatever it was happened to you. So I try my best to lead with empathy, and a listening ear is best practices in my opinion.
Alicia, sorry to jump in. Brooke, I have a question for you. Do you think empathy can be taught? For some folks, it might be really hard. That what you just described might be really challenging for them. Do you think empathy or compassionate, like communication as like a skill, can it be taught?
It's a really good question. I think there's like, some people have like a natural affiliation for it, and it's in, I don't know if any of you guys have taken the Gallup Strength Finder, but empathy is a skill. And that's my number one skill on Gallup Strength Finder, which like I was in financial services for a really long time. So like that was kind of funny to me. And that like, so I think some people do have like a natural affinity to it. And like, we've all been there, like, you know, when you talk to someone, right, and they like the way that they listen to you and the way they ask you questions, and the mirroring back what you've said, I think that makes people feel heard. So there's certain techniques, I think, certainly that can be taught, but it's a muscle and it takes a lot of practice for some people. And I think like from what I've seen in the podcast, and just like, I think, I don't know if anyone's else had this experience, but like when I tell them what I do and what I have a podcast about, people, they want to tell me their grief story. Like that's pretty immediately what happens to me. So I like, my joke is I skip small talk with people. Like I don't talk about the weather. Like people want to talk to me about their grief experience. So I think like, yes, but it takes practice. So like you can go to like, there's coaching programs like NYU here in New York offers a great one, but there's books you can read, but it takes practice. But I think it can be taught if someone has the motivation to learn it and the discipline to practice it.
Yeah, and I would just to piggyback on that kind of, I think that especially, again, I'm thinking sort of in the remote context that we operate in, right, where you know, just so many things can get lost in translation, right? It's like, okay, this isn't a Slack conversation. And so one person might be truly coming at it from a place of empathy and compassion, but just the way that they're sort of delivering the message isn't being received, right? Communication is very much two-way. And so part of the best practices in terms of, you know, exactly what you said, right? Mirroring back what they said, kind of scheduling follow-ups are sort of ways to try to work around, even in the case where we have individuals who generally are sort of empathetic humans, that it's not coming through in Zoom, or maybe the way that they're asking the question, or the question they're asking. I think it was mentioned earlier, right, of the conversation around, you know, how much time do you need, the way that can be asked, where it can either come from a place of, you're really, you know, we're trying to be flexible and give you what you need, versus it can make someone feel like, oh gosh, should I be scared about asking for too much time off, right? There's so much nuance there. And so I think it's definitely a muscle that I know we work to develop with our people managers. And then even just with the folks on my team in terms of how we're approaching that conversation with employees, because it really is, it's very delicate. And I think it does require, like you said, practice.
Yeah, there's actually research on this. And in particular, loving kindness meditation is one of the forms of meditation that we've actually found in the research can help people cultivate empathy, but everybody has a certain innate capacity as well to either build on or cultivate. And I think this brings up a broader topic of just being honest about the staffing that you have around supporting your employees. You know, I can't help but think of all these different sort of organizations in the past that have had a chaplain in place. And sometimes we refer to ombudsman or whatever, but a person that's actually literally there to listen to you. And I think that all companies need to consider, well, what are the qualities of that person and what kind of roles could they hold? And being able to identify that person, make sure that they're comfortable with this, because, well, furthermore, not everybody might be comfortable with them, but at least having that person there to be sensitive enough to say, okay, I may have my own limitations. Maybe there's somebody else who could be a liaison for us with this person. So being able to check in with yourself and say, for some reason, the way I'm communicating here is making things worse. And I don't know why, but I need to at least note it and pass it on to the proper person, whether it's a fellow colleague or a family member or something, so that this communication can happen more productively and more compassionately. But having that kind of structure in place in your organization, identifying that person, but as well having that kind of bereavement sensitivity training or whatever it is, this is not something that it's not a conversation I hear often in companies. It should be happening more.
Yeah, and I think going back to, I think Kara, might have been you who said it, but there's a cost to all of this. It's a business, right? And businesses want to be profitable, but I think there's a really high cost to not investing in supporting employees, whether from a grief and loss perspective as it relates to our conversation today, but like generally, right? Like you hear now, especially like more and more people are leaving because of culture, they don't feel supported by their manager, et cetera. But if you go through a loss and have to come back to work and your team or your manager or someone is not supportive, I think for a lot of people that would be like, like maybe this is not where I want to be, right? Because it changes you, as we all know. So what are some of the business impacts of grief and loss, or any misconceptions there?
I can jump in on that. I think we've looked at a lot of research with Better Leave. We've looked at research by some of the top global brokerage firms, so groups like Willis Towers Watson, Locked In, Mercer. Some of these groups we've looked at data from. We've looked at data from a company called GrieveWell, which is a nonprofit that's been studying grief for a decade or two. And most recently, the World Economic Forum published a study this year in 2022 of kind of the acute outcomes. And it was pretty astonishing. So quoting the World Economic Forum, in the US alone, the dollar amount directly impacted by grief and loss is a lack of $942 billion of productivity and performance loss. It's hard to really think about that on such a big scale, but if you distill that down to your organization, it doesn't matter if you're a 10-person team or a 5,000-person team, you can actually have a dollar amount or impact your organization, because the truth of the matter is, at any given time, 20 to 25% of your workforce is going through some sort of life event, grief, loss related life event. And if you think about the time alone, the productivity loss, and you think about let's say the hourly rate you're paying that person, it could be, in the upwards of thousands of dollars, by not supporting that person that you're losing, right? And so those are some simple ways that you can think about why you would want to invest in maybe a bereavement program or a bereavement leave or a policy or anything like that, because, paying a few dollars or whatever it is for time off or 3 days of time off versus them, losing productivity time of potentially 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even upwards of 4 weeks, depending on the grief loss, you're saving thousands of dollars. And so that is definitely something to think about, is what is the lost cost of the high cost of not supporting your employee group. And you guys, we all know, the pandemic has really refocused a lot of priorities for individuals and families. We've seen deaths, unfortunately, increase significantly as a result of that. And so I think we have this really incredible opportunity to come back from the pandemic. And HR leaders, Savannah, I'm sure you think about this. We have an opportunity to redefine how we think about our operational excellence, how we think about our communication strategies, how we think about our total rewards benefits. We get this chance to start over or do it again or hit a reset button, a really incredible way to like make HR and organizations like of the future, and not just the way we were doing it for the last 20 years. And this is giving us a platform to reset and redo and try new things and support people differently. And I think that's one of the silver linings of the pandemic, is now we have data around what is the actual impact and cost and implication of grief and loss to my organization, and what can I do about it. And I think there's a lot of interesting groups focused, even like yours, Brooke, around educating folks and then partnering with them and helping them build inclusive policy. So we have even more resources than we did 2 years ago, also as the result of the pandemic. And so I think there's a really big opportunity as you think about crafting your well-being for your organization. Like, what does that look like, you know, for you, even moving for 2023? We partner with a lot of people's now, a lot of companies now, even thinking about what are 2023, what does that look like? What does well-being look like for us as an organization for that? So it's great. I think employers are really starting to be proactive around understanding the costs and the value and what they want to do next year. So we're seeing a lot of increase in employers that are wanting to support their workforce.
Yeah, which is so great that, like, I think, and I don't know if it's generational, Dr. Medrano, to your point earlier, but like that, or this concept of like, people are whole people and we have to account for all of that in the workplace, but that the companies are willing to invest in that is really fabulous. We are getting close to time. I want to see if the audience does have any questions, which I think Brooke or Christina would be able to see. And if not, we do have a final question here. So Christina or Brooke Wilson, if you can see any questions from the audience. And if not, I have another question, so it's okay. All right. So one thing that I really like to focus on my podcast, and I think I'm like super type A, like millennial, like, and so I wanted like, what are tactile things I can do? What are tactical things I can do? Because I felt so overwhelmed and lost. So I was like, where is the list? Like, why isn't anyone telling me about that I can get my dad the airline miles? Like, I wanted like specific things that like I could do. But I think as it relates to this conversation today, what is one thing that we can put into practice to better support our colleagues or friends going through grief and loss? I'd love to hear from each of you on this, and then any other last thoughts that you have. And thank you all. This has been a great conversation.
I think kind of how we were talking about if empathy can be taught or built upon, that is a little more complex to like quantify in a person and to develop. But I feel like something on the most fundamental basis that anyone could do is have an open door and an open mind. Because at least if you are saying, hey, I'm open to hearing what it is that you're going through, hearing how I can support you and what our team can do, what I can do, anyone can build off of that as a starting point to start to mold what support should look like for others. And maybe eventually too, coming across different similarities and being able to build out a program down the line based on the different similarities that you're hearing from other people and seeing what is common, what is uncommon, what can we facilitate immediately, what can we have to build out in the next couple of months, and just using that as the starting point for how you can be better and provide that support for your team and individuals.
I think I'd like to build on that as well. And actually it's sort of implied in what I hear you saying, Alicia, is actually knowing our comfort level as well with having these conversations. What is our own personal process around grief? And I'm sort of sounding like a broken record here, actually, but I do think that is the starting point for all of this, because these communications have to be authentic. I mean, ideally, of course, we can be professional, and it's good to fall back on professionalism, and we can take maybe one day bereavement training for how to manage it, so that we know sort of the best tactics. But at the end of the day, the most impactful way to make sure that somebody feels safe to discuss their grief, to make a plan for how they can be in the workplace if they so wish, and still feel supported and safe and going through their personal process, that we need to feel comfortable ourselves or identify somebody who is. And that's also starts with just being honest with ourselves and just saying, maybe I'm not the right person for this, but being able to identify somebody who is. I think that's really the starting point of these conversations, because the management goes from there. Again, one simple thing that could set somebody off when they're in a state of shock and loss is not really being heard or understood. And that could change the whole course of the conversation about their future with the company. And so I think it's really key, what I'm trying to repeat over and over. Sorry.
Yes, I'll double click on both of those, and I'll just sort of add the layer. I know, Kara, you mentioned the sort of psychological safety as the top of that pyramid. Couldn't agree more. And I think sort of another way that can be explored is when folks see leaders and people at the top modeling behavior, it makes them feel safer to model that same behavior, right? So, in a more straightforward sense, taking time off just in general, right? Taking PTO, if folks see our leaders are, hey, I'm taking this week off to go on vacation with my family, and no one's, everything's still running, and it's okay to take that time. It makes it so the rest of the employee population feels safe to do so. And so I think, when our leaders are really leading from a place of empathy and compassion, being very intentional about asking, our middle managers how they're feeling, how they're doing. I think that just kind of gives permission to the rest of the team to feel that much more safe. But when they see their leaders kind of keeping things too, I don't want to say tight-lipped, but just sort of just not modeling that behavior, right? There's a feeling of like, am I allowed to share this? Am I allowed to kind of take this time off? And so it really does, I think, start at the top in terms of creating that psychological safety.
I'll add to that. I love that. In addition to creating that culture and psychological safety and that culture of well-being that you just described, Savannah, which I loved, you also hit on something that I would love to end with is know what your employer benefits are and utilize them. There's nothing worse than having an entire suite of offerings, and as an employee, like, you never actually looked at what they are, or you never enrolled in them, or you never took the time. And that's the biggest one, is that a lot of employers are embracing better benefits. I know, Savannah, you said financial well-being benefits, mental health benefits, even bereavement care benefits. Like, know what benefits your companies offer and utilize them. They're probably sponsoring them or paying for them. And know what they have, and ask your manager or ask your HR leader or your business partner, what are those benefits? Because they want you to utilize them too. And so definitely know those and utilize those. Another good example is if you have a 401k policy and you're having maybe some trouble paying for a funeral. A lot of cases, you can take a loan out of your 401k. It's an interest, back on yourself. It's better than going into like potentially credit card debt. There's so many tips and tricks and ways and things that you can utilize as your part of your benefits. So know those and utilize them is what I would leave you with.
Sorry, I had muted myself. We did this great. Was excellent last points, and the whole conversation has been wonderful. We did get to questions from the audience in that we can rapid fire answer. Unfortunately, can't give these the time that they need. The first is the philosophy on how to ask for proof or documentation on need for time off. And then the second is, how can these resources help support pregnancy loss? So both of those I feel like require longer answers than 4 minutes, but if anyone has quick thoughts on either of those questions, I know that the audience does have an interest in them. And if not,
I'll I'll just
go
start
ahead.
with say, going back to the sensitivity piece, like that first question regarding proof. I think it's a really great question because it probably comes from some experience, I believe, if somebody's asking that. As this is probably one of the more triggering questions for somebody who is grieving. And like, again, like all things we've been talking about, approaching it with a great deal of sensitivity and empathy is key. Because if you're just coming forth saying, I need proof of time off, then you are going to throw off that conversation in a really bad way. So empathy is the first part. I think it's really just understanding your company policies and making sure that you visit this topic to say that there should be some leniency here, because it's not always that simple for somebody to be able to conjure up proof. Hopefully it's not a rigid policy in most companies, and just making sure if it is, then maybe you need to revisit that.
Yeah, I think the sensitivity piece around this in particular of the way this is presented, like if someone was like, oh, hi, we need proof, I would be like, are you kidding? Like, but to be like, well, like, unfortunately, we've seen people take advantage of this in the past. So like we do require, in order to grant this benefit, that like, can you provide us a death certificate, an obituary, what have you, might be a better way to go about it. But I think also like some people need to take bereavement leave like 3 weeks later, right? So then how, I don't know if that would affect it at all. If anyone has thoughts on the pregnancy loss question, I feel like that's a whole conversation that could be at least an hour. But if anyone has things they've seen where companies do support this, or ideas of where people can get more information on this that they can share.
I think somebody might have answered it in the Q&A chat. I think maybe Brooke Wilson, but I'd say the first thing is there are interesting state laws on the individual state level that are coming out with mandated bereavement time off for employers. Illinois is one that comes to mind that just rolled out in the last month or two, a new bereavement law that is inclusive of pregnancy loss. And includes pregnancy loss, fertility loss, even adoption loss, the entire family forming basically loss. What's interesting, and I know we don't have time for this, is but answering for there's only a handful of states that have state level mandated bereavement. So what do you do if you're working in a state that doesn't have that? It's 100% up to your employer to define what that leave policy is and looks like. And unfortunately, I think we all know that bereavement is not covered under any federal policy, and FMLA doesn't cover it. It ends. And so that it is really tricky and challenging. I think we are going to see state compliance around bereavement laws change pretty rapidly over the next year. And we're already seeing some states queue up potentially policy. And so that's just something to keep in mind. But again, other resources that you can go to around pregnancy loss are obviously localized resources, community resources, and groups. There's mental health coaching resources as well that you should look into. So just keep an eye out for some of those changing policies, I think, too, around pregnancy loss and defining that as a bereavement event. So, but again, a much longer conversation.
Yes, absolutely. All right. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time as it's top of the hour. Thank you to all of the panelists. This has been a wonderful conversation, and thank you everyone for attending and prioritizing this conversation. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Brooke.